Welcome to Cures and Capital, the podcast on value creation in biotech and pharma.
I'm Martin.
And I'm Simon. And we are here with another episode, this time with Jeff Holder and Adam Siebert. Both are managing directors and partners at L.E.K Consulting's life science practices. So Martin, what can our listeners look forward to today?
We are going to discover how advanced modalities are reshaping biopharma and what it really takes to bring these breakthroughs to market. Jeff and Adam unpack the science, the business models, and the future of medicine in what I would call a must-listen conversation. But Simon, before we go in, what are modalities?
So modalities are the different types of molecules we can have in our R&D pipeline. So they come in various shapes and sizes and complexities. So we all know the good old aspirin tablet. So that's a small molecule. And those we make in the lab, in a reaction flask, in a real chemistry lab, and then we put them into a tablet. And then we have also now sort of classical antibodies, which we more make in the same way as wine. And then we turn them into these biologics, the antibodies. And then we have this relatively brave new world of advanced therapeutic modalities, which include engineered cell therapies, gene therapies, and nucleic acid therapies. And in this episode, we'll learn more why they're advanced and what are the implications operationally, commercially, R&D-wise, and so on.
Before we go in, please subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, as it helps us attract new guests. And as always, all views and opinions expressed in this podcast are our own and do not represent that of our employers.
Now, please welcome Jeff Holder and Adam Siebert.
So welcome, Jeff and Adam, to our podcast. It's nice to have you on.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be here.
I think it's the first time we have two guests here. So could you introduce yourself? What has been your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Jeff Holder. I'm a partner and managing director at L.E.K Consulting. We're a global strategy consulting firm that has a significant focus in the healthcare sector. And within that broader healthcare subsector, Adam and I focus on an area that we call life sciences enablers. These are B2B businesses that sell products and services across the life sciences value chain. So that could be research tools, diagnostics, pharma services, more broadly like CRO or CDMO services. And Adam and I focus a significant amount of our time on the discovery, manufacturing, and supply chain of pharmaceuticals. So myself personally, I was a chemist by training, did a PhD in organic chemistry, and decided that a life at the research bench was not for me, and was more interested in some of these 30,000 foot view questions, some of these big picture questions about why companies do what they do. And that's ultimately what I found was strategy. So got very interested in strategy and why companies made this decisions that they made and the choices they made, and started a career at L.E.K and never left. So been here about a decade, and it's been an incredible journey with some front row views and some mega trends that have changed the biotech industry. And it's been a privilege to have that seat.
I'm Adam Siebert. Similar to Jeff, I'm a scientist by training. So my scientific training is a PhD in cell biology. So I come at things perhaps from a more biologic angle than what Jeff does. And I think that complements each other quite nicely as we think about our clients' core issues and challenges that they experience. Similar to Jeff, I realized very early in my career that being a bench scientist was not for me. I would say one of the key reasons for that is just the time it takes to go from what I was doing, which was a pretty basic research project, to get to something that's going to impact people. It would take quite a long time. And so what we do currently at L.E.K is really having these kind of shorter projects and engagements with clients that really have real world impact pretty much immediately. So it's really exciting to be able to work with clients on their really challenging issues and be able to impact patients again in a pretty quick turnaround. As you can see from my background, it's in the video. We're located in Midtown Manhattan. So I've been here for 12 or 13 years at this point. And been a pretty interesting ride so far, and looking forward to continuing it going forward.
Great. It's great to have you both on, and we are looking forward to address some of the topics. Of course, the focus of today's podcast is going to be about advanced modalities. And I think before we jump into that topic, into the details, we have quite a diversified audience, and some of them might not necessarily be aware exactly what it is. So could you help us and give our listeners a simple primer? What do we mean when we say advanced modalities, and how are they different maybe from the traditional small molecules and biologics?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start and I'll let Adam layer on. So when we think about the pharmaceutical pipeline, there's both the type of molecule, again, whether it's a small molecule or a larger biologic like an antibody. And we consider those to be the legacy modalities, if you will, of the pharma pipeline. The way that these were discovered and developed has been relatively well codified for more than 100 years for small molecules and 40 plus years for biologics now, particularly the antibody space. But there's another set of drugs, many of which are biologic in nature, that have different mechanisms, that have different delivery vectors or form factors that can unlock novel mechanisms of action and deliver medicines that we could not deliver, or therapeutic effects that we could not deliver with a traditional biologic like an antibody or a small molecule inhibitor type molecule. So these include cell therapies, they include viral vector gene therapies, they include nucleic acid therapies like mRNA. I think everybody has some experience with mRNA COVID vaccines over the last couple of years, and the broader toolkit that can unlock, such as genome editing with mRNA. And these are the modalities that we talk about inclusively when we say the advanced modality space. And why they're exciting is because they can unlock novel therapeutic effects, new mechanisms of action that can have material changes on the outcomes for patients for diseases where we historically weren't really able to treat the root cause of those diseases. And now with some of these medicines and their ability to impact the genetic root of these diseases or impact the immunology in a novel way, we're able to more fundamentally treat the causes and the root cause of diseases and really bend the curve on some outcomes for patients.
The things that I would add to it is maybe more from the supply side and how these drugs or molecules are getting made. I think, Jeff, to your point, the small molecules are chemically synthesized, right? And so it's a pretty defined pathway that chemists have taken to make the active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs. Once you start moving into the biologics, that's where we rely on cells, right? So biological cells that are producing the active drug substance that's going to, have the therapeutic effect inside the patient. Once you get into the advanced modalities, that's where you start combining or have the potential to start combining the different methods of production, right? And so I think as Jeff alluded to, right, so the cell therapies and viral vector gene therapies, those are still made biologically, but then there's a bit more heterogeneity in terms of using enzymes or chemical synthesis to make the mRNA or to make either, other things called oligonucleotides, which are shorter stretches of nucleic acids, and even combinations of the two, right? So there are molecules called antibody drug conjugates that combine a biologic or an antibody that's linked to a chemical payload that effectively kills cells. And so what we're seeing in the space is a much more complex ecosystem, not only of drugs that are being produced and having different impacts within the patients and different mechanisms of action, but also different production needs and infrastructure that's required to make the increasingly complex set of therapies that are being discovered and developed and manufactured today.
I think that was a very comprehensive overview. And I mean, what I got from you, Adam, is that there is a certain difference in how we produce them, essentially. I mean, in very like terms. And what I got from you, Jeff, is that it opened up a whole new world of potential cures, even that biologics and small molecules before couldn't, right? Did I get that right?
I think so. I'm always hesitant to say the C word, cure, but I definitely think we can have some outcomes that would not have been possible with the legacy modalities.
Okay, that's good, because now we are also slowly moving towards the name of our podcast, The Cures and Capital. So potentially we can have cures. You have written that the next generation of drug modalities, like the cell and gene therapies, but also the previous ones we have mentioned, they will require new business models. So what does that mean? How do we translate all this complexity into potentially a compelling commercial proposition, and how would that look?
That's a really good question. So one of the key features of many of these advanced modalities is that they are increasingly designed rather than discovered. And what we mean by that is that in the traditional sense, again, coming from my roots as a chemist, typically what you do is a highly iterative discovery process where you build from an initial hit and try to iterate around that molecule structure to make it a better drug candidate, a better fit, have a better pharmacokinetic profile, etc. So it's a highly iterative process that is a lot of trial and error and is a lot of 2 steps forward, 5 steps backwards. It takes a long time. It's very cost intensive, and it's not highly predictable in terms of generating success. There's certainly no guarantee that any hit or series will lead to a promising candidate. in some of the advanced modality spaces, because what we have are components that are highly conserved across the different drug types. So for example, if you're an mRNA medicine, well, we have mRNA, it's the same 4 bases in every molecule. So you're effectively designing, for example, a sequence to code for a target of interest. I think in the viral vector space, you have certain different delivery vectors that are known to successfully deliver the genetic medicines to different tissue types. So there's some modularity here in terms of what are the vectors we use, what are the payloads we use. So it's a little bit more of a designing what you want against the targets that you're looking at and mixing and matching that functionality across the different levels of the vectors and the payloads and the different layers of functional control inside of it. So I'm not saying it's an easy process, but it's more designable in terms of, the targets you're trying to engage and the pieces of the puzzle that you have to optimize. So it's a little bit more designed, not discovered. And what that means practically is that some of the bottlenecks in terms of timing and certainly risk are moving downstream from discovery. And you think about historically, discovery was a very long process, multiple years, expensive, low probability of success. And then once you got a candidate, you still had to go through clinical development before you reached the commercial stage. So net, it was a very long process, but a lot of the time and risk was upstream. And of course, there's meaningful risk in clinical development. Can you show efficacy? Can you show safety? But for something like a small molecule, there's assuming the drug works as advertised and is safe, there's a relatively well-established commercial pathway to distribute the drugs and to be reimbursed. That's less of a risk on the commercialization, and certainly on the manufacturing side. As Adam pointed out, we know how to manufacture small molecules for 100 years or more at this point. If you compare that to the advanced modality space, maybe we can go through discovery faster because they're more designed, less of this highly iterative, reaching around in the dark, trying to optimize multiple parameters. Maybe you can get to a candidate faster, but then the risk goes downstream, particularly on commercialization and manufacturing. Still clinical risk, of course, but that's the same as the other modality set. You need to make sure that the drug works as you envision from an efficacy standpoint and is safe. But there's less clear commercial pathways to build the commercialization story. And there's less clear and established methods for scalable, cost-efficient manufacturing. And that's where the risks get pushed as you move into these advanced modality paradigms. And we've historically seen sponsors running very, very fast toward the clinic to get to market first with this vision that winner takes most, first to market takes most in some of these new classes of therapeutics, but have underinvested in both the manufacturing and the scalability of that manufacturing, and particularly in laying some of that commercial groundwork or thinking about what it's going to take to drive commercial uptake of these new therapies. It's not a build it and they will come market. It requires a lot more preparation on manufacturing and commercial than I think anybody appreciated 8 or 10 years ago when these were newer ideas and the excitement was about rushing to get first to market.
I think there's also a push and separation of regulatory approval versus commercial adoption and payer approval, for lack of a better terminology, right? The manufacturing of these advanced modalities, the COGS are quite expensive, right? You're looking at hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars per dose for a patient, which is great, particularly going back to that C word that we mentioned before. If the product is curative, right, people are willing to pay millions of dollars for that product. However, because of that huge price tag that is orders of magnitude greater than what we've seen traditionally from either small molecules or from traditional biologics, payers are much more sensitive and much more restrictive in terms of giving access to patients. And so as you think about clinical trial design and what endpoints are needed and what data are needed, not just to show that, hey, it's safe to take or it's efficacious, but really that it's going to have a meaningful impact on patients and perhaps more importantly, on the insurance companies and their bottom lines. That's where you start seeing quite a bit of separation when it comes to patient adoption and the commercial models that are used to drive this. The second piece I would say is most of these advanced therapies are genomically based and are very, very deep into personalized medicine. And so finding the patients that have these mutations, which increasingly, as you move into gene editing, and I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of CRISPR-Cas9, that's where you're going to start getting into very, very small and select patient populations that have very, very specific mutations in their DNA that, maybe you can only treat 10 patients in a year with that given therapy set. And that's, again, going to be much more difficult to find patients for clinical trials that are going to prove out that this is working. And then, later down the line, insurers are going to accept paying for and reimbursing for those therapies. So it gets a little bit more challenging just as, precision medicine and personalized medicines get into the mainstream of really having the proof points to say, yes, this therapy is working, not only, again, from a regulatory perspective, but for a value perspective as well.
That makes sense. And I think we'll unpack some of these as we go more into, as you mentioned, the COGS are much more expensive in some of these therapies. I think we'll unpack a bit more of this when we go into the how do we make a tangible business case, and I assume what does it mean. But I think there was one, for me as someone who doesn't have all these scientific terms and necessarily the knowledge, I think there was something, Jeff, you mentioned distinction between the older therapies or legacy therapies, as you mentioned, and these new advanced modalities is that the legacy therapies that tended to be discovered and these new ones, they are rather designed. In very simple terms, would it also mean that it also requires much more knowledge up front? I assume only that's how you can design something that then have a bigger probability of success, right?
It means there's a more knowable set of starting points. I think, if I'm doing a small molecule drug discovery program, sometimes I don't even know what my target is. Sometimes it's phenotypic, right? I'm just throwing molecules at a cell and hoping to see a certain outcome, right? And other times you have a target and you're trying to find a hit for it. And again, you're throwing a library of compounds at it and hoping to find a hit. So it's starting from zero. For some of these advanced modalities, you're starting from a known payload, right? Am I going to deliver an mRNA for something? Well, you know what an mRNA looks like. The question is, what do you want that mRNA to code for? You can think of that as the software of your cells, right? It translates the DNA, makes RNA, makes protein. So you know what proteins you want it to code for. You can work backwards to make the RNA. And then there's certainly lots of things to optimize in terms of the level of expression and to what extent it does or does not perturb the patient's immune system. There's lots of things that you still have to optimize, but you have a known starting point. And I think that's maybe the biggest difference with some of these advanced modalities is there's a more defined starting point. And that's why you can take that starting point and design and iterate, and you can use tools like computational tools, in silico modeling, things like that can be quite effective in some of these advanced modality spaces. So they can help accelerate from that known starting point to a candidate or a set of candidates that you can then test and kind of quickly decide what you want to move forward with.
Yeah, okay. That makes complete sense. And I wonder, Adam, I also have a question for you before I hand it over to Simon. And that is, you mentioned that these new advanced modalities, they tend to have sometimes less patients, so smaller patient populations, which also then probably means that when you do your trials, you have to go with much less patients than you are traditionally used to. Now that we are discussing how do we translate this into an operational business model, are pharma companies and the biotech companies, are we set up correctly to be able to run those trials? Or is it something that we haven't figured out yet? I assume it takes a lot about the regulators to be able to approve those, but also for the companies to have the skill to run trials that are now much smaller size, right?
Yeah, there's a lot in terms of patient identification, getting those patients to the right clinical sites, right? You could imagine, if there's 20 patients born in the US each year with a given disease, it's really hard to identify those 20 patients and get them to more or less centers of excellence where they would be able to enter a trial and potentially be treated. So the infrastructure to do that, I think, is perhaps not as optimized for these micro diseases as one would hope. But I do think that there's also more from a regulatory edge, and I think we're going to get into this in a bit, thinking about platform designations, right? What do you need to actually prove out as being safe to actually, then be able to use in different diseases or different subpopulations of a disease, right? So you can have a platform that says, okay, I have, this targeting moiety or targeting port of a molecule, and then it's connected to something that's actually going to kill a cell. Well, if I change where it's going to go by changing one half of that molecule to something different, how much more clinical research do I actually need to do? Or if we get into viral vectors, same thing, or mRNA, maybe, right? Where we change that mRNA sequence. And so now, if you change a very small portion of it, is it actually a different molecule, or is it just a different, it's the same platform, just slightly tweaked a little bit, right? So there's questions from a regulatory standpoint of what is the minimally viable, perhaps product, right? Or a platform that we can identify. So that way it knocks down some of the development barriers and testing that's needed. So that way we don't need to retest safety, or we don't need to retest, the nth degree of efficacy to say, yes, this is useful for patients, and we can get that out there. So I think overall, as the technologies improve or shift, I think there's going to be changes, not just within the pharma companies in terms of, having a different clinical trial operations department or different development pathways, but then also from regulatory. And then going back to what I said earlier, which to me, I don't know, there's a quote from like a former president of ESPN, Don Ohlmeyer, I think, that's the answer to all your questions is money, right? It all comes back to payers, right? Are the payers going to be satisfied with this and say, yes, it's safe, but most importantly, it's effective, and we're going to reimburse. So I think that again, as we move into truly personalized diseases, there's going to need to be a shift in how the industry as a whole sees the development path and proof of value for these molecules.
Thank you for unpacking that. And now over to you, Simon, to maybe explore some of that.
Yeah, no, I think we already painted a picture of some of the challenges for the industry and the operating model, business model, how we approach these fancy modalities, to call them that. But if we then look at, let's say, start at a company level, at a strategic level, how do you make the case for potentially entering one of these more advanced technologies or modalities? Let's say you have a legacy in small molecules and perhaps, I don't know, antibodies, and then you're thinking about the gene therapy or cell therapy. So how can we use the same business case template? Is the strategy process different making a decision for entering these areas?
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, I think it's been challenging to make the case. You've certainly seen several high-profile exits from the advanced modality space from large pharma players. I think even last week or earlier this week, Biogen announced they're exiting the viral vector space. Takeda just announced they're exiting the cell therapy space. So I think you're starting to see some decisions where companies have not had success or do not have a platform to build on. They're making exits. And then there are others that are more plot committed, you might say, in terms of they made some of the early acquisitions that they have a platform. So Gilead buying Kite and scaling that platform, BMS via Celgene scaling that platform, Novartis to some extent in both RNA viral vectors through acquiring Avexis. So there's companies that had acquired their way into a first wave leadership position, you might say, and are scaling those platforms. And then there are others that did not and are making decisions now to direct that capital elsewhere. How do you make the business case for a program or for one of these modalities? I think, yes, you need to believe that you have the technology capability and that you have something scientifically interesting. That's clear. But what the mistake that was made in the first generation of these therapies is perhaps to say, I have a technology, it has the ability to address this disease area. I have a hammer, this is a nail, I can hit that nail with my hammer, let's go do it, without giving as much thought to the level of unmet need and the requirements for commercialization or for adoption, both on the provider, the payer, and of course the patient side. So a good example of that might be hemophilia, would be probably a fairly high profile example. So for example, in hemophilia, we've seen some struggles entering that market with gene therapies, namely from BioMarin with Roctavian and Unicure CSL with Hemgenix. Those are two viral vector drugs targeted at the hemophilia space. And ultimately, these are patients who are relatively well managed. So they're not cured by any means by the therapies that are out there, but they're well managed. They can tolerate and manage the symptoms of their disease throughout their lives with increasingly less disruption as the drugs have gotten better in that space. So this is a scenario where you could argue there isn't a super acute level of unmet need where a patient is going to try a potentially one-time, potentially meaningful shift in the outcome. But there's risk because no one's been dosed. We don't have long-term data. We don't know how long the effect could last. And there's questions about the durability of this effect. So the patients and to some extent the providers saw that the risk benefit maybe wasn't there. If you contrast this to where we have seen significant uptake in the viral vector space, spinal muscular atrophy. So that would be the Apexis, now Novartis drug Gensma. Natural history of that disease is horrific. It's a degenerative disease that impacts patients very early in infancy and causes high morbidity and mortality relatively rapidly. And there was really no good ways to manage those symptoms. Managing the symptoms didn't change anything there. So those families were willing to take the risk on a chance from the gene therapies. Similarly, you could look at Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Even though there's been lots of high-profile safety challenges with the Sarepta gene therapy, Levitus, the patients and their families, particularly the younger patients who haven't had as many safety issues and who don't have any other options to really address the root cause of that disease, are still very interested in those drugs. So it's not just can we scientifically, technologically address a disease. It's, is there a level of unmet need, and is the risk benefit appropriate for the ecosystem today in terms of what options are out there?
Sorry, I was just going to piggyback on one thing there. And earlier we talked a lot about having genetic subsegments of patients, right? And that really narrowing the addressable patient populations for given drugs. Here, it's a little bit different in terms of the narrowing of the addressable patient populations, right? It's more based on disease severity, right? It's when Jeff was talking just now, it wasn't necessarily to downplay the impact that hemophilia has on its patients who live in fear, you get bump into something or you're going to bleed out, right? But it's more about, there's gradations of the disease. Yeah. And for the more mild patients, right, that's where maybe it's not really addressable or the need isn't great enough. But for the ultra severe, maybe that's really the target population for that, which obviously narrows the window considerably. And so as we think about pharma companies entering the advanced modality space or targeting a specific disease, I think it's really critical to have an honest eye on what segments of the population are really going to adopt. It's like the TAM versus the SAM, right? The total addressable market versus the servable addressable market, and be realistic and honest about what that is, because those are vastly different things when we come to how that could translate into the opportunity and commercial opportunity for these therapies.
Yeah, I think that's a clear remark. And I think so if we then look at, let's say a company has decided to enter a new advanced modality, then we look at the asset level. How does the investment profile change over the life of such a development program? I think, Jeff, you already mentioned because if it's a small molecule, it's pretty straightforward and the costs are relatively contained. But if it's, let's say, gene therapy, cell therapy, you're going to invest a lot very early. So it also means if you're a biotech company, it's the whole funding, it looks different, I guess.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is particularly we're just earlier in the life cycle of these modalities, and we've not had decades of advancement on how to industrialize these processes. So you're trailblazing. If you think about some of the early players, they did not have an ecosystem of partners that were available to help really. There were not a ton of viable CDMO partners out there that had any experience, that had ever produced anything on commercial scale in the cell or gene therapy space. So those first wave players had to effectively build it themselves and go alone in terms of scaling their manufacturing and the investments around them. Granted, at the time, it was easier to raise money also, and they were able to make some of these investments. But now you're increasingly seeing a challenge where a company has an asset and it has promising technology, and they're getting to the point where they know they should be thinking about industrializing their manufacturing process earlier, preclinical even, but they certainly don't have the capital to do so, and that they need to get to the clinic to start to generate the proof of concept data to generate the next round of funding. So there's a bit of a chicken or an egg problem.
I guess one of the big potential advantages is if you could make it much more modular, generic, the manufacturing process, and already mentioned a bit about this, the FDA's platform technology designation. So, I mean, if we can just only need to change one small thing in this computer program, if we print mRNA or something else, but where do you see that sort of umbrella, more generic manufacturing and regulatory pathways?
It's a really good question. And I think there's two things that are going to be important for helping to make scaling these drugs easier. And one is certainly regulatory pathways that we've talked about. Adam made reference to the platform technology designation, where you can validate components of that recipe, right? And the FDA and other regulators can say, oh, we've seen this before. We don't need, you can reuse some of the data, whether it's some of the preclinical data, some of the CMC data, you can reuse certain things. Again, this is early. We haven't seen a significant amount of precedent here, so we don't know exactly how much this is going to help, but this is certainly a lever that will help save on time and costs to get through early R&D. And then the second lever is the ecosystem of partners is much more mature now than it was. That there are viable cell and gene specialist CDMOs out there that have commercialized products, that have taken a program from early R&D through the clinic and started to launch into the commercial market. So there's a much more mature ecosystem of partners that biotechs can rely on for outsourcing. And as the space matures, to your point, we used to say the process is the product, which would imply that everything was so highly customized that making the drug was the drug effectively. But to the point now, as these modalities mature, they will platformize and they will have some more standardized recipes, for lack of a better word, where there will be more mixing and matching with the given framework of the recipe. And that will help both on the CDMO side as well as on the sponsor side for how much you have to reinvent the wheel every program. That should minimize over time, right? We should be able to turn that wheel faster and faster as we get to the second, third, fourth generation of some of these products.
I think that makes sense. And I was thinking also, before I hand it back to you, Martin, that, I mean, you already mentioned the CRISPR technology. We discussed gene therapy. And even this so-called, I mean, let's call them successful CRISPR companies, they've actually been under tremendous pressure, and we see companies exit gene therapy as well. So where's this trending? Are we about to exit and move out of these? Or because you also say that the whole ecosystem is maturing, CDMOs and processes, but I'm a little bit, I mean, where do you see this going overall?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll give my 2 cents and then I'll let Adam weigh in or contradict me and then say what he thinks. But in the viral vector gene therapy space, I think we're seeing a little bit of a retrenchment into higher unmet need, very rare monogenic diseases.
Yeah.
I think we'll see a lot of interest in the CNS space, of the neurology space. There's a lot of monogenic diseases there that are extremely high unmet need. And there you might argue the risk-benefit profile could be there. There's plenty of challenges there from a commercialization standpoint. Many of these will require procedure, to dose, whether that's intrathecal dosing or even intracranial kind of surgical type procedure. So there's plenty of barriers, but there's the most probably low-hanging fruit benefit for these super rare diseases in the CNS. The other area where we are seeing some platforms being built are around different value propositions. So more of a cell factory. So using the viral vector to deliver, instead of to replace a gene that is dysfunctional, which is typically what you see at rare diseases, to express a therapeutic protein of some kind that we know has function. So it has more of a compliance and dosing value proposition. So, okay, we can express this protein that you need therapeutically for a long time, durably, reliably, by doing this gene therapy injection instead of having to, get a shot in your eye, for example, for glaucoma or wet AMD. So that's a different value proposition, and we'll see what the uptake of that is. None of those have been approved yet, but there's a couple programs that are coming to market that will test that value proposition. So just to recap, there, rare monogenic disease in the neurology CNS space, and then potentially the protein factory value proposition that has more of a compliant dosing value proposition is going to be tested. In the cell therapy space, I think we see very good success in hematologic cancers. So hem-onc, that's where Carvykti, Yescarta are, blockbuster drugs. So you're seeing them push frontline therapies there. There's early success stories in solid tumors. So Amtagvi, Tecelra have reached the market in solid tumors. I think we'll continue to see progress there. And the big area of excitement is the autoimmune space. So going into things like lupus and the potential there to get into larger patient populations or move outside of oncology is where there's a significant amount of excitement in that space. And then dovetailing that into the mRNA world is be remiss if we did not talk about what's called in vivo cell therapy. So you've probably seen lots of M&A deals between pharma companies acquiring these in vivo CAR T or in vivo cell therapy players. One of the biggest ones a couple months ago is AbbVie buying Capstan for, I think it was over $2 billion. It was the reported deal value. And here the idea is, okay, well, you can affect a similar mechanism in terms of engineering a patient's T cells to basically fight their cancers. But instead of having to take their cells out of their body and do the engineering and then reintroduce the cells, which is a lengthy and expensive process, you could do the engineering in the patient's body. So you dose them with an mRNA or a viral vector that adds the CAR to the T cell in the patient's body. So you take away all of the process of removing the cells, engineering them and reintroducing them. And it's more like an mRNA medicine or a viral vector therapy in terms of how it would be given. So there's a lot of excitement there because it would solve some of these logistics and COGS issues that some of the cell therapies have had, and it's potentially a more scalable business case. So there's a lot of excitement there. Pretty early days, no publicly released clinical data as of this recording, but early next year will be exciting to see some of the early clinical readouts from a couple of the more advanced players in that space.
I think it's important to give context to where we are as well, right? As we think about viral vector gene therapy, which is the one that we're seeing the most retrenchment in.
Mm-hmm.
If we go back to 2024, so last year, I think there was somewhere, and Jeff, you can correct me if I'm wrong, somewhere in the 600 to 650 assets in development within global pharma. The first approval for a viral vector gene therapy was in 2017. So it took, 7 years to get to 600 assets in development.
Mm-hmm.
If you compare that to monoclonal antibodies, the first monoclonal antibody that was approved by the FDA was, I think, 1986. It took 22 years, so until 2008, to get about 600 monoclonal antibody assets in development. So comparing the 22 years to build up that pipeline to here just having 7, right? There's a lot that needs to get thought through. Right. And this is going to get into the weeds. But if you think about monoclonal antibodies being humanized versus fully human, right, having the right production capabilities, that stuff gets worked out in time. So right now, I think, we're going through a more challenging period in terms of really finding our footing, making sure that the technologies and processes that we use are hopefully getting more and more efficient, thinking about the different safety issues that come up, particularly if you are dosing very high systemically. There's been some safety issues around that. And so can we be more targeted in delivery and therefore be to dose less, make less, bring down the COGS, right? So there's a number of different technological advances that particularly will be helpful. And then it's also, Jeff, again, made reference to a hammer finding the nail, but it's finding the right nail and finding the right diseases to go after in the right patient populations. And so my view is we're still early innings, despite having a lot of noise around it and some early successes, but also some failures. And so there's too much potential value. Again, going back to that C word, there is potential value in having cures coming out of these technologies, but I think there's a little bit more patience that's needed before we've put the death nail into an entire modality. There's going to be some shifts along the way. There's going to be other modalities, whether that's radiopharmaceuticals, whether that's antibody drug conjugates, multi-specifics that come up and compete, and they all have their advantages and disadvantages. But there's a lot going on that really sheds a lot of promise across the industry, and hopefully, we'll get funding back, and both at a federal government level as well as more private investments to help spur that growth going forward as well.
I think it's well captured. So there's some ambiguity exactly how this will continue to mature. So maybe some of the companies making an exit from some of these advanced technologies will come back, or maybe they will have made the right choice. That's to be determined. So I'll hand it back to you, Martin.
And I just want to say, I think you put it into perspective very nicely, right? Because in the beginning, there was quite a hot trend about these advanced modalities. Now, yes, some companies are retracting from the field, but that doesn't necessarily mean we are ready to put the advanced modalities into a coffin, right? There's still a
That's
potential.
Right.
And I actually wanted to come back to this. We mentioned companies retracting from the field, but we also mentioned actually companies coming in, and then some companies coming in through acquisition, so acquiring their way into the first generation of therapies. So basically buying into the space. Some companies may be taking a more of a waiting or slow approach. I wonder, what do you advise your clients on where to play at risk with these emerging modalities versus buying and coming in with an almost finished product? And I'm wondering whether it differs from what you would advise clients with the traditional modalities, smaller molecules and biologics, where the tendency used to be you buy something that is almost there, so you basically de-risk, and only thing left is the commercial risk. I assume with these, it's kind of flipped. Just because you bought something that is technically de-risked, you are still left with the regulatory, you're still left with trying to find a commercial business case for it. Does it in any way differ what you would advise to client if they want to open up this space for themselves and enter that?
Maybe I can go first on this one, Jeff, and you can contradict me. I think a lot more about the infrastructure that surrounds a particular program than I do about what the commercial opportunity is. I think that the cost of development and commercialization, at least from what I've seen and what I've experienced, right? People think much more about what the revenue opportunity is and not what it takes to get there. And so as you think about the emerging advanced modalities, right, they're going to be quite a bit different than something that has been a little bit more plotted out, right? So autologous cell therapy as an example for hem-onc, right? That's going to be, there's 100 centers of excellence that are treating patients with autologous cell therapies in the US and maybe into Europe too. I haven't checked those numbers lately, but like that infrastructure is developed and sketched out, and that's an easier pathway to follow. If you compare that to radiopharmaceuticals, right? Particularly, Novartis has a big lead that has Pluvicto. One of the key things that's happening within radiopharm is shifting of the radioisotope, which for a lot of different reasons it's shifting, but one of them is the possibility of moving towards lead. And lead has a very different half-life that requires different infrastructure, right? It's 10 hours. So it's basically manufactured just in time, whereas other isotopes are, days. And so as we would think about investing in a radiopharmaceutical that has a longer half-life versus one that has shorter, the recommendation on what you would need to think about and how attractive that is very, very different. And so it's more holistic view. And I'm probably not answering your question directly, but it's thinking about what else is needed, not just how many patients are there, how likely are they to adopt, what do I need to get them to adopt, but it's last mile logistics. It's manufacturing scale up, meaning if I'm treating 100 patients, do I use one 10,000 liter bioreactor to make the product, or do I need 10,000 1 liter reactors to treat those patients? And so those are the dynamics that really you need to start thinking about early to see what is the actual value of this. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's tough to do it's really an individual asset by asset basis as you think about this and really what is it that would move the needle for the company, right? What moves the needle for Pfizer is going to be different than what moves the needle for the Adam Siebert pharma company,
Yes.
I would think about the portfolio effect and how it fits into the broader risk profile of what you're looking to do. I think generally some of the larger companies can feel like they're going more conservative now and starting to retrench toward more proven spaces that, frankly, it makes sense if you think about it. There's a patent cliff coming in pharma that everybody is talking about, right? Big revenue gaps coming from many of the large brands from loss of exclusivity. So they're looking to fill revenue gaps that are coming in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So they do need some sure bets. They do need some things that are going to help address those revenue gaps. But at the same time, I think it shouldn't be overlooked to take some degree of risk on the upside of something more exciting that could be more mid to long term, like some of these spaces. So it's probably a balance. It's probably a portfolio effect. Every company's got its own profile in terms of risk benefit and how much revenue they might be losing from this patent cliff that they need to think about solving for. Yeah. So the answer is not one size fits all, but generally the kind of barbell approach to a good amount of what you do being relatively predictable, and then a couple more high innovation, high risk, high reward opportunities can work. But people don't like to fail, and they don't like how it looks when they make a bet that doesn't pan out. So there's risk aversion for sure in the industry right now, particularly given how capital constrained it is.
Mhm.
And I think now you mentioned that the industry is getting risk averse and they can see that patent cliff. But I wonder if is it really less risk by regressing to the well-known modalities, molecules, or because
No,
it seems because you also we know the target herding, we know but then it seems comfortable because it's well-known territory, but is it really lower risk?
we were having this conversation the other day with some investors that we like to chat with, and we made the point that there's the target concentration point. Our colleagues at L.E.K published an article showing the target concentration of the pipeline, and something like 25% of the pipeline is targeting 35 targets. It's an extreme concentration risk. And then the other, even if you zoom out from specific targets, even within indications, the point that this investor made is that immunology is a very hot space, for example. But every big trial enrolling in immunology is taking much longer to enroll than expected because there's so much competition for the patients. And then, the right patients who fit your exclusion-inclusion criteria, just not that many of them for all these trials that people are trying to run in lupus, for example. So yes, you've got target risk, you've got concentration risk, got to some extent execution risk and timeline risk on your trials. So yes, it's maybe more well known, but there might be less scientific risk or manufacturing risk, but there's different things to consider and to weigh. And certainly right now there's been a retrenchment away from scientific or technical risk and more behaviors that seem like the market is accepting more timeline and clinical execution risk, it seems like.
If you look at different company sizes, also companies you work with, and let's say we have a company with 1,000 people, to use that as a scale factor, and one with 10,000 and one with 100,000 people. So how many modalities should each of these companies have in their portfolio?
I think we're the wrong people to ask that, frankly. Adam and I don't directly advise sponsors on kind of organizational things that often. I think we typically help with how to get things done on the manufacturing and supply chain side, and not as much on even if you need R&D strategy, I think we're giving our opinions, but that's not where we spend most of our time.
We're consultants. We have opinions, right?
We have opinions. Yeah, well, I'll let you.
Just as I think about it, right? I mean, there's a difference of where those people are, right? Is that the commercial infrastructure? Are those global versus US only? Are we including manufacturing and tech ops and quality in that? And the reason I bring that up is to sell and commercialize 5 different therapeutic modalities, but they're all targeting the same call point, the same physician groups. That's a very different thing than we need you to manufacture 5 different things, because those require at least 5 different facilities, 5 different supply chains. Everything about it is different. So it's a bit more nuanced into what is the overall strategy and where are we focused, who are we serving, and what's, are we the manufacturing arm or do we outsource that, right? Yeah. Because then it's a lot easier to just outsource it to 5 different CDMOs in theory, at least, and then commercialize all into the same call point. So to me, it's a broader focus question. And I would argue focusing in on being, we're the neuro company or we're the Parkinson's company or whatever it is, and then think about what are the best therapies that are going to impact patients. And if that one happens to be a oligonucleotide, the next one needs to be a small molecule, and the third one is something else, I think that's feasible. Not necessarily the easiest, but I think it is feasible.
I think that's a great answer. What I had in mind was also the operational aspect. So I mean, I don't know how much it's in fashion these days, but the term modality agnostic, and we've seen some companies use it over time. And then Martin and I, we were discussing briefly the Takeda case study over the years, how they went from being a small molecule company, and then they had like 12 different modalities, and now they are focusing again. So I mean, it's just if you're a biotech company with 3,000 people, you probably can't handle 12 different modalities, because I think the biologists, they will love it because the biology is more or less the same, and the corporate strategy department will probably love it as well. It's a bigger playing field. But if you look at, for instance, the CMC part or preclinical tox or histopathology or whatever, I mean, I think there's probably limits to how much you can actually master.
But again, I would argue, I'm not sure that that's on the modality or just the pure number of products, right?
Yeah.
Having 12 small molecules for 3,000 people, that's going to be tough as well.
Yeah.
And so it's, again, in my mind, and also, what is the stage of those products? Are you taking, are those all commercial? Are they discovery through clinical trials? Because that's all going to require different silos within your organization to behave differently. I generally agree with size comes some ability to diversify and to have a bigger portfolio. I'm not sure I'm willing to commit that that's on the modality focus end, or if that's just on the pure side of the portfolio.
So now we zoom out again, almost where we started. So if we now take this 30,000 feet view and we invite you back in 5 or 10 years, how do you see the modality universe evolve over time? I mean, are we going completely back? So in the end, it will, once the AI really starts working, then we'll go completely back to small molecules, molecular weight less than 500. Or what do you think?
I think small molecules are definitely not dead. There's a lot of interest in that space. Yes, I think the in silico tools and whatnot will be helpful, but I think more in terms of things like PROTACs and kind of advanced small molecules, let's call them. I don't think it's all going to be under 500 weight, Lipinski rule, small molecules. I think that's evolving, but antibodies will still be a super important backbone of biologics. But yeah, we'll see more decorated antibodies or conjugated molecules, antibody oligo conjugates, antibody drug conjugates, antibody radioligand conjugates. I think this idea of conjugation is going to continue to scale and diversify.
Yeah.
And then I think if I had a hot take for an area where it's been super out of phase, and I think people wrote off mRNA really fast.
Hey.
The COVID vaccine and billions of doses of Moderna and BioNTech vaccines. And then the RSV vaccine doesn't look super effective, doesn't look like a good launch. And then people wrote off the entire space. And I think it's going to be really important in delivering different genetic medicines. And that could be for gene editing. That could be for things like in vivo CAR T, like the Capstan platform. That could be for delivering neoantigens for oncology therapies. There's life cycle management around, oncology drugs. There's lots of different ways that modality could play and could function. So I think to write off the whole world of mRNA because COVID downslide and now maybe it's not as effective in infectious disease vaccines as everybody had hoped is maybe a little premature.
I am one of those that perhaps prematurely wrote off mRNA. I hope you're right. I mean, to me, I think having more things to throw out disease is a good thing. So I'm looking forward to that. The one that's I'm most interested in, and I'm going to say it, this is not an unpopular take, is peptides, but not for the GLP-1s. I think their ability to be used as the targeting part of the decorated biologics that Jeff talked about, whether it's ADCs or radiopharm, their ability to get to targets to cleared from the body. I don't know. It feels like that's something that's of interest. Similarly, oligonucleotides, so the tides and the novel ways that those can be manufactured, right? But if you think about Codexis and their enzymatic production method that really supplants or has the potential to supplant more traditional methods, that to me is super interesting and could unlock a lot of opportunities, particularly if that technology advances and not only scales, but also has the potential to make longer oligonucleotides. Those, I would say those are probably where I'm most excited. I'll be interested to see how the just-in-time manufacturing pans out and whether that's autologous cell therapies, whether that's short half-life radiopharmaceuticals, or, some of the baby KJ N of 1 diseases that are being discussed, how that plays out over the next 10 years. And also back to Jeff's point on the mRNA, if we think about personalized cancer vaccines or immunotherapies, however we want to term them, that ecosystem and the supply chain that's needed to make those is fascinating to me, and just a complete shift from that scale-up method to the true scale-out, and how regulators will enable that or not is a fundamental question that I think will unlock the next 10 years of therapies.
Do you dare speculate how many Cs we'll get over the next 10 years, the curative treatments? I mean, it can only go wrong, but do you see, I mean, will it be like a hockey stick? So maybe we'll have an order of magnitude more every decade? Or and again, I was thinking about, as we spoke, also thinking about small molecules, because I think the antibiotics, I guess they are small molecules and they are curative, right? And we probably, I mean, the Hep C is maybe another area, and HIV, antiviral. When we really start to see it, is it like just around the corner, or is it still in for the long haul?
I think it's long haul for large diseases,
Yeah.
right? I think that there's going to be, and it depends on how you define it. Cancer or some forms of cancer are more chronic diseases now than they are actually, lethal diseases. And so we are seeing movement across the board. It's just, I don't know, it depends on how you define it. And honestly, there's still questions in my mind of some of the gene therapies. Are they actually curative, or are they, right? We just don't have the data.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to punt on it. It's the optimistic person, which I don't know how much of that person exists in real life, but the optimistic person thinks, sure, we can get tens in the next 10 years. If you look at the pipeline and what's coming through and how rare diseases are developed and, getting to market, I think we can do it. It's also a question of, once it's in market, how many people actually have access to it?
Yeah.
And not just in the United States, but globally, right? And that requires a lot of technology unlocks to get it to a COGS point that opens up some of the less affluent markets.
I mean, if you think about, Adam said this earlier, that they took so long from the first monoclonal antibody approval to get the pipeline to where it was, comparable to last year's viral vector pipeline.
Yeah.
3 times as long, right? We went 3 times as fast in the gene therapy space, for example. But it also took 12 years from the first approval to the first approval on what you could consider the platform of today. Rituximab was the first approval that I can think of that was made the way that we now think of how we make monoclonal antibodies, right? It took 12 years to figure out what that scalable platform was, let alone to scale it to the point where it is today. I think we're in the early innings. I think there's lots of really smart people working on some exciting solutions to these problems. And the outcomes that we can evidence with these modalities are too powerful that it's like squeezing toothpaste out of the tube. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. We know what it's capable of now. So I don't think people are going to abandon the potential of these therapies because it's hard. I think that's why we do what we do, is because, it's hard, because it's worth it when we can solve these problems and change the course of people's lives and health outcomes.
No, I completely agree. And I think now I try to bring us back from the helicopter and looking at 10 years ahead to something extremely practical. So if you meet a biopharma, a CEO in the elevator going home from the office today, and he or she tells you that they're about to kick off a strategy seminar and they're also going to discuss modality strategy, what would be the sort of ultra quick advice to a biotech or biopharma executive going into that process?
Hard to come up with a blanket piece of advice that would fit to everybody. I would say persevere and stay creative, particularly around your financing. I think that's obviously what keeps a lot of CEOs up at night. But I think it's a golden age of biotechnology, and that we have more opportunity than we have capital to effectively fund. So I would say be focused, make a informed, focused decision on what you're going to do, say no to a lot of things, and then really, really, really work on that value story for what you are doing and where you are focused, and make sure that you have a clean, easy way to articulate that to the investor crowd on why this is creating unique value, or what problem your program is uniquely solving and is uniquely positioned to solve.
I would argue, don't always go after the shiny object. Shiny objects, one, it collects a crowd and makes it a lot more challenging to win once you get in there. But also, oftentimes the shiny object is ones that are more emerging and will require a lot more work to actually get to the promised land. And so sometimes it's okay to go with the tried and true and not chase as much.
And I think with that, let's close it up. Is there anything we didn't discuss that you feel should get out there?
No, thank you both for your time. This has been our pleasure and a privilege to speak with you and to share some thoughts on how we see this really dynamic space moving. It's an exciting time to be in the biotechnology space. I do believe we're in a unparalleled golden age of innovation and technology, and it's going to make for some really powerful medicines that we can develop in the next decades.
And if our listeners want to get a hold of you, what's the easiest way?
Sure. Yeah. So again, it's Jeff Holder. I'm in the San Francisco office of L.E.K Consulting. You can email me through our website. It's probably the easiest way to get to us. And typically at many of the conferences in the advanced modality space. So if you're at Meeting on the Mesa or ISCT, Advanced Therapies Week from Facilitate, these are places where we're happy to meet up and say hello.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm Adam Siebert. I sit in our New York office, similar to Jeff. Get a hold of us through our website and be happy to connect either through virtually or at some of the conferences as well.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So, Martin, this was our conversation with Jeff Holder and Adam Siebert. What did you take away?
So many things, but I will try to name two. So first of all, I think this world of advanced modalities was fairly new to me. So I think there was a lot of nice descriptions and explanations that Jeff and Adam provided that I think made it so much easier for me to understand what it is that we are talking about. It took me quite a while to get there. But I think as we then unpacked the conversation and then started talking about the business models and the business cases, a little bit also connected to the discussion we had with Jason is he mentioned differentiation just for the sake of differentiation isn't enough. And I think the message I got here is that, yes, the technology is exciting, but the technology alone is also not enough. It has to really solve something. And as they were describing, it's like these technologies, these new modalities, they can be really, really, really expensive. So unless there is something more to it than just a cool technology, it might be a very hard sell. And I think that's what we also see with a lot of new potential drugs coming to market that then fail because they cost an exorbitant amount of money. And I think it's a hard sell to the buyers. How about you, Simon?
So you mentioned Jason. So that's Jason O'Neill that we had on a previous episode where we talked about drug commercialization. So what did I take away? I think, we called them advanced therapeutic modalities. Maybe we should call them too advanced therapeutic modalities. I'm somewhat skeptical because I think they are damn difficult to work with. I mean, there's a promise of very high levels of efficacy if we can really crack the nut on these, but still the manufacturing process, I mean, supply chains, commercialization, reimbursement and negotiations and whatnot. And maybe to mention another episode we did with Murray Aitken from IQVIA Institute, where they also have these indicators of progress in healthcare. And one of them is around also the expanded access of novel modalities like cell and gene therapy, because it is not today something that is delivered at scale. Like if you have, of course, a statin, the statins are off patent, but you can deliver them at scale everywhere in the world in truckloads. So I think there's something there that's really tricky. So why have we talked ourselves into this extremely complicated modalities? And maybe it will eventually become like a commodity and everyone can do them. I'm not sure, but I still have maybe it's nostalgia, but the small molecules, I think we'll see a revival with small molecules. And as we discussed a little bit offline, that there are like 10 to the 60 possibilities for making small molecules. That's more than there are stars in the known universe. But we have to sort through them in a clever way. And maybe AI can help us there, both on the biology side and on the chemistry side, because there's nothing as elegant as a small molecule that's cheap to produce, and you can put it in a tablet and you can ship it anywhere in the world. So that's a little bit sort of maybe also a reminder that as a pipeline strategy choice, that the different modalities you pick actually has very dramatic operational implications for the organization. So they look really fancy and nice, and you can do a lot of things, and it expands your toolkit. But operationally, it's not for everyone, and especially not cell and gene therapy, that's for sure. And we see a lot of, recently organizations pulling their hands back from these modalities because they didn't deliver. Yeah, so that's a little bit my rant on why I think they are maybe too complex for many organizations, but they still have absolutely their merits. But let's see in maybe 5 or 10 years where we are, if they've increased their presence or we are going back to a small molecule renaissance.
I think despite it being a rant, I think it summarizes it actually quite nicely, right? Because one thing is they have a merit. They absolutely do. But it's really important to stay focused. So while they do have a merit, you really need to be focused on what works for your strategy. You shouldn't just chase it because it's a hot new trend. It's this shiny object that is out there. I mean, the worst thing you can do is defocus yourself and then you do everything poorly. So I think you said it nicely. It has a merit. It makes sense. but it needs to be a much more calculated bet. It isn't just something you jump into and then it works. It takes quite a lot of effort to make it work, whether it is about how you produce it, whether it is about how you commercialize it. There's so much more thinking that has to go into it for you to make a viable business case. And I think that's what Adam and Jeff and your rant right now put a really clear picture to.
Yeah. I think focus is really the key point. As you say, you cannot be good at more than 10 different things because it's not the same specialist scientist working on those chemistry types in the organization. And it's also not the same commercial organization, not the same factories or CDMOs. I think strategy is focus, if you only want to use one word.
And I think we had many guests up until this point, including Adam and Jeff, that all pointed out to the same thing, right? The most important thing, you have to focus, really have and especially in this example, really have your business case sorted out. I mean, even more than ever before, do you really need to understand what you're going into? Otherwise, you can jump into it and then you will be one of those companies that detracts 3 years after because it was too painful and not expected.
Pick your modalities wisely. There's nothing wrong with small molecules and antibodies and maybe sprinkle it with some peptides. But then I think you are 80% of the way and then the rest is icing on the cake. But that's my simplistic view and I'm happy to be corrected. Send me a message on LinkedIn or somewhere else if you disagree.
I think it's a nice place to end this podcast on. Pick your modalities wisely. I think that was a very nice thing to say, and I think it summarizes it nicely.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. That was a great conversation. Please check our Pure Capital podcast page on LinkedIn. Just search for it and you'll find it. Not miss a future episode. And if you have any feedback or critique or kind words, just send them to Martin or myself. We're also on LinkedIn. Until next time.
Take care.
Bye.